This particular research is part of a larger body of research that Tanuka, Ghoshal and I are doing, in which basically we're looking at the relationship between consumption and threat, or status and threat. So when we say self-threat, we're basically talking about when you have some sort of a psychological threat, something makes you feel inadequate about yourself. Now that can be anything. Maybe you didn't get the promotion that you wanted at work. Maybe you're an athlete and you find out that you're not as physically fit as most other athletes. Or maybe your sense of self-worth is defined by how much money you have, your social class. But whenever you encounter a situation where you feel like I'm not as good as I thought I would be or I could be, what tends to happen is that people try and compensate for it. They try and make themselves feel better when they experience these aversive states that we call psychological threat. So what past literature has already shown us is that there's lots of ways to cope with this threat, so to speak. For example, maybe you'll say that, well, being athletic is really not that important to me. I might not be athletic, but I'm a very smart person. So you try and play up other aspects of your identity. But what we do know is that one major way in which people try and cope with threat is by consuming things. So what do they consume? For example, when people's sense of status, their sense of power is threatened, what we know is that they try and consume luxury goods. They try and consume goods that enhance their status. You see that people, when they feel dejected or they don't feel as powerful, will go out and buy that signature Louis Vuitton monogram bag, something that's very conspicuous or something that's very flashy, that tells the world in a sense that I have arrived. Another way that people can consume to offset threat or to cope with threat is that they consume to kind of distract themselves. So I think everybody in the world can identify a time when you felt bad about yourself, something has happened that makes you feel down, and you find comfort in that tub of ice cream or in that bag of chips. So sometimes even unrelated consumption like eating fatty foods, these are ways that people cope with the threat in the world around them. Now what's interesting is that Professor Ghoshal and I have essentially identified a new way that consumers can use to deal or to cope with threat. So far people have looked at things like status signaling consumption. They've looked at the consumption of unhealthy foods to take your mind off, the source of the threat. What we find is that when consumers engage in something that we call high-intensity sensory consumption, HISC as we call it, essentially the experience of listening to loud music, looking at bright colors, any sensory consumption that is very intense actually seems to have the same end effect as buying that $3,000 Louis Vuitton bag or consuming that 3,000 calorie bag of chips or of ice cream. What happens when you listen to loud music, when you see bright colors, when you touch things in the environment that have lots of stimulation, lots of sensory intensity, is that you actually end up feeling better about yourself. And for some reason, as we'll explain later, your sense of self-worth seems to be restored. What we mean by high-intensity sensory consumption is that any experiences, any sensory experiences have some key properties. When we're talking about our sense of hearing, intensity is defined by the volume, the decibel level. When we're thinking about our sense of vision, we're talking about things like brightness, saturation of colors. When we talk about our sense of touch, maybe it's the level of stimulation that you get when you touch things. So each of our sensory modalities has one or two key features that that you can vary on intensity. And what we mean by high intensity sensory consumption is that when you encounter a sensory stimuli, when you encounter a product that is very high on one of those dimensions, very bright, very flashy, very loud, has a high tactile stimulation, those intense sensory experiences somehow seem to make you feel better about yourself after you faced threat.
Both Professor Rishtee Batra and I are trained to do experimental research because we study consumer psychology. And so this research is also has been studied via a series of experiments that we designed. So what we wanted to look at was what happens when people are made to feel threatened about their sense of self or their sense of self-worth. How do they react, and do they actually gravitate towards these high intensity sensory stimuli, as we have called them. So the way we manipulated threat is we had participants do this series of general knowledge questions, answer a series of general knowledge questions and do some other mental cognitive tasks. And then we manipulated the feedback that we gave them. So these questions were a little hard, so they didn't quite know that whether they had answered them correctly or not. But what we did was we told half the participants that congratulations, you've performed in the top 5% of all those who've taken this test. And to the other half of people, we said, unfortunately, you've performed in the bottom 5% of all those who have taken this test. And these were the people who were actually made to feel threatened about their competence. And because they're students, their sense of competence is an important aspect of their self-worth. So, and we did check that that indeed was true. So basically what we find when these participants who were subject to self-threat, they actually tended to gravitate towards these high intensity sensory stimuli such as bright colors, or when they listen to music, they listen to it at a much higher volume compared to the others who were not subject to self-threat. And so this is how we actually manipulated self-threat and then looked at their preference for intense sensory stimuli. And what we find also is after people consume these highly intense sensory stimuli, their sense of self-worth is restored. So they actually feel better about themselves. Another thing, we also wanted to understand why this actually happens. So what we have found is that basically what these high intense sensory stimuli do is they actually raise your levels of arousal or alertness, which in some sense distracts you from the thoughts of the negative experience that you just had. So this is how it actually works. So you no longer have the resources to sort of elaborate on what has just happened and the source of threat that you may have just experienced. And this is what actually works to restore their sense of self-worth. We are in the process of looking at whether different kinds of threat have different kinds of impact. One particular study in which, again, we manipulated self-threat in the way that I just described. We had participants complete a general knowledge task, and half the people we told that you performed in the top 5% of all those who've done this task, and the other half we told you performed in the bottom 5% of all those who've completed this task. And the people who were told they'd performed in the bottom 5% of all those who've taken this task were made to feel low about their sense of self-worth, which is something we did measure to make sure that was happening. After that, we told them to put on headphones and listen to a piece of music. And this particular music, we told them we always have to give them a story about why we are doing this particular research. We told them that we are trying to see how people feel about this particular kind of music with respect to its potential use in some advertising context. So they actually listen to the music and they evaluate the music clip on various aspects of how much they like the clip, whether they're familiar with the music, have they heard it before. But what we were really interested in was the volume at which they were listening to this music clip. So we actually had our research assistants go around. So we had subjects come into our behavioral laboratory, which is at ISB here. And we had our research assistants going around monitoring the volume at which the computers were set when they were listening to the music. And that was really the dependent measure that we were looking at, the volume, which is the intensity of the sensory stimulus. So that is how we actually operationalized intensity of sensory stimuli in the auditory domain. We did a similar experiment where we had them evaluate this bright orange color of paint. Okay, and we gave them the story that this is a shade of paint that a national paint manufacturer is thinking of launching in the market. So what do you think about this color, whether you like it or not? What would be an appropriate name for the color? And we looked at how much they actually liked the swatch of paint that we showed them. We had actually chosen a very, very bright shade of orange, which is actually described by Benjamin Moore, the paint manufacturer, to be Mardi Gras gold. So this is as intense and exuberant as the festival itself. So it was a very intense shade of orange. And what we find is that the participants who were subject to self-threat liked this bright shade of orange much more compared to the others who were not subject to self-threat. So that is how, again, we operationalized intensity of sensory stimuli in the visual domain. In another study, again, looking at preference for intense sensory stimuli in the visual domain, again, we subject participants to a threat, and we find that those who were subject to threat preferred this particular design of a flash drive, which was extremely flashy and gaudy and was set with stones, compared to a more ordinary looking flash drive. So again, preference for these visually conspicuous products also comes through when we actually subject people to a sense of threat about their self-worth. Study is important from a consumer welfare point of view. So if you think about it, what do people do when they're feeling low about themselves? Often, you know, they just reach for a bag of potato chips or a tub of ice cream to feel good about themselves, or they go on a shopping spree to sort of distract themselves. These can be construed to be detrimental behaviors. So our research suggests that people can indulge in alternative activities involving high intensity sensory consumption, which are not detrimental. For instance, if you're feeling low, go to an art museum, indulge your visual sense, wear bright colored clothes, you'll feel better about yourself, or listen to your favorite music at a very high volume. So that will also restore your feelings of self-worth. Again, it can be used in retail atmospherics to some extent, but again, from the consumer welfare point of view, if you think about, if you want to curb people's spending on categories that are not good for them, for instance, I guess if a supermarket manager was concerned about making people spend less on unhealthy sort of food product categories, then if that area of the store was very well lit or brightly lit or painted in bright colors, then people might choose to consume less in that particular category. So maybe that is one way of using it in retail atmospherics.
The most obvious welfare to the consumer is that we found an alternative, much more healthy way for you to cope with stress. Most people, when they do feel stressed, when they feel inadequate, when they feel like they've been threatened, they turn to these expensive purchases. They turn to these unhealthy habits to console themselves. What we're saying instead is that maybe you don't need the bag of chips. Maybe you don't need to go out on a shopping spree and max out your credit cards. It's simply turning up the volume when you're listening to music. Maybe it's going to an exciting movie that will kind of, bring you back to your base level. Much healthier routes to basically bring you back to your status quo.